So we're continuing on. We are continuing on the discussion of Sotah 28b and the understanding of the Mishnah, and further going through the Talmud, understanding the status of the law. And further on, we've discussed the first initial understandings of the Mishnah, telling us the law which relates to the woman, that she's a suspected Sotah, and now she can't have any relations either with her husband at this point in time, because she's still in the status of suspected Sotah, or even potentially if she was divorced, she wouldn't be able to go to her paramour either. And Rabbi Akiva has told us that he's learnt it out from the word verses uba'u in a similar fashion with the extra vav that exists in nitmo v'nitmo. He says that this word, the passage of ba'u is in that same format, and from the extra vav we learn out that not only she's also to her husband, she's also to someone else from the extra letter. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi gives a different approach, and he wants to say that he's learning it directly out of the words v'nitma, and that's what we're going to discuss. That's what we're going to discuss today in today's class. But if we look at a context and a little bit of some more history in the way the Mishnah and the Gemara is organized and its own history of production, remembering that the oral law was exactly what we just called it, an oral transmission. It wasn't written down. The oral law is a transmission of teachings from Moshe Rabbeinu that he received at Har Sinai throughout the generations and to the people in Israel. But they might have been coded or written or said in different ways. And this was all transmissions that was passed down from father to son and teacher to student through the history. At the time when it was seen to be necessary to change that format because of the invasions, because of the loss of the tradition by virtue of the wars that have gone through in the land of Israel, the rabbis, the rabbinate was very concerned that some sort of traditions would be lost. So they took all those separate teachings, which they had been passed down to themselves, and tried to formulate them in the most succinct way. The list of teachings were edited by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, and that became the body, which did then get written down, but that became the body of the Mishnah. After further times, the content of the Mishnah and the precision of the Mishnah was always known, but the implications of the Mishnah weren't always exactly known. By comparison to other texts that we had by tradition, called brises or tosefta, which literally actually mean that they were teachings, but were brisa means called out, actually comes from the word of being outside. So they were outside the body of the Mishnah. That's the understanding of the word brisa, that they were texts which weren't as exacting and weren't selected by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, to be part of the be part of the Mishnah teachings, and but when we examine them, when the B'nai Yeshiva, when the people in the houses of study wanted to understand perhaps what was something implicit that wasn't said explicitly, they sometimes compared it to other versions to try to elucidate and understand what were the differences, what are the hints in there, what might they understand. Still trying to keep it in a oral format, but at a much more concise format. And I mentioned Brisa, so while I'm talking about it, I'll just complete it. And there's also the body of text called Sotah, which are also similar teachings, which also didn't make it in the canon of the Mishnah text, because in some ways what was explicit in the Tosefta or the Brisa was already possibly by an astute student, which could be derived and could be understood. And because all this was an oral tradition, the entire Mishnah at this point, even at the editing of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, wasn't necessarily written down. This is information this is text which was learnt off by heart from and taught by the teachers. We hear, and in the flow of the Talmudic discussion, we sometimes meet a personality who's called a teacher, because he was one of those. His role was to repeat teachings that he had heard, and he could teach them on. And interestingly enough, these roles are assumed, but then we find out in the Talmud, after some discussion, that we can find instances where we say, oh, that teacher didn't memorize or didn't recall that teaching precisely, and that word wasn't this word, it was that word, and therefore that's how you would have, and that's how it's implied in the Mishnah, by this precision, by the being precise here or there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so coming back to our specific Mishnah, we're understanding an already known rule that the lady in question is in the status of a Sotah. What the Mishnah is telling us, and as we are to know, we're not arguing the status of the woman. We know the status of the woman. That is the halacha. That's already been known, that she is in the status of a suspected Sotah. What we're asking, and what the Mishnah is telling us, is that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi says that I derived this information out of this verse, is the nitma b'nitma in particular, and the superlativity in the extra word of vav, which is in nitma vert nitma, that extra vav. And Rabbi Akiva said, well, I don't need it from there. I learn it out of the bottle, and I've learned it out of there. We did discuss in the last year extra information that Rabbi Akiva learned out, how he learned out, or how he derived from the bottle and the mentioning of it, the three times as it was, and references to the paramour as well. Okay, so that's where we're up to in our summary of what's happened. What the Mishnah has told us at the beginning of the Mishnah, that we said that we said, and I'm now just going to share that part of the screen. So this is here the Mishnah,
Mhm.
So, and we said, and that was over here the bottle reference, right? Um, and we said we learned the bottle, and because it's in the same format as Nitma v'Nitma, Diber Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Kach Hayaderish, Sakari ben Akotzov, and this is a given extra credibility because this is the way Rabbi Yeshua was agreed and with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Huda Nasi says, no, I can learn it, and as we've just discussed, I learn it out and I derive it out directly out of Nitma v'Nitma. Okay, and that is the Mishnah. Past this point, the Mishnah will go on to some other topics. So we're going to move to the Talmud section, which discusses this little section which we introduced before about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So that is in line 18, which we will come to shortly. So this is the area where we got up to in the previous class. Right? So the Talmud in its discussion now discusses and starts off and says, Omer Rabbi Yeshua Kocha Yoderis Zacharia, etc. And you've got the Bechulu here, which means etc., which refers to the lines that we did in the Mishnah together just previously, and starts a little discussion about it. Revising it, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says that the two times that the defilement of the wife is stated in the passage indicate that there are two prohibitions due to her defilement. One is to forbid her to her husband, and one is to forbid her to the paramour. And he learns it out of the words v'nitma v'nitma. Fine. So now we are going, and we're now quoting another text. As we had the introductory discussion of a brisa, the Talmud is now referring to a brisa and says we have something, the same content of the Mishnah embodied in the following brisa, and we're going to compare and contrast in some respect to it. So we start, and he says, Ton Rabbanon, the rabbis taught in a brisa, Shleish pa'amim ha'amrim b'pasha, with regard to the three times that the defilement word is mentioned. So at this point, we have already some thoughts in our mind, because our Mishnah has really only pointed out two occurrences of the word nitma. The brisa is now starting off and telling us, well, there are those three mentions, and we continue. So that's something to note to ourselves, that the first thing is that we've mentioned three mentions versus the two. Continuing. So with regard to the three times of the defilement of the passage, namely the one of nitma, nitma, and nitma, so the two references, and it mentions. So then we inquire, Lama, why are they necessary? What is the purpose of all of the three? So that question, why are the three necessary? That's implied in the word Lama. Okay. So Lama, why are they there? Now the brisa is now telling us Echad Labal, one for the husband, Echad Laboil, one for the paramour, but Echad Latruma, and want to teach us that she is prohibited to truma. What does that mean? So let me, break off and do a little bit of context over here. If her husband was, if her husband happened to be a person of Cohen status, she would then be entitled as part of her family, as part of his family, to eat of the Kohanic portions. To eat part of the Kohanic portions, you need to be um, of correct status. And the correct status that we're talking about is that she is the wife of a Kohen. However, now she is a suspected Sotah. Being that she's a suspected Sotah, it might turn out that she needs to, she's now extracted out of the family context because she's either, as we discussed before, somewhere in the spectrum of being allowed to be with a husband or disallowed, or in some sort of level of divorced or separated from him. So in that case, she wouldn't then be allowed to eat truma. Hence, the Brisa has told us that the passage, there are three mentions of the word nitma. Omar Rabbi Akiva, the words of Rabbi Akiva there was one for, and teaches us three items of knowledge. Okay. Someone else, another personality, Omar Rabbi Yishmael, mentioned in the Brisa, another great teacher of Israel called Rabbi Yishmael, and by the way, just to acquaint you with Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yishmael was a very great sage of and a colleague of Rabbi Akiva, somewhat of a colleague, and there are many instances in the Talmud where there are teachings of Rabbi Yishmael and many teachings of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is probably more well known, but Rabbi Yishmael also, to the point that we have in the text of our Siddur, we have the quotations from the methodology of how to learn out, the expressions out of verses out of the Torah. We are taught, and there are the 13 methodologies that are expressed by Rabbi Yishmael that were taught in his, what he utilized as part of his paradigms for understanding and deriving information out of the written text, corroborating and telling us halachas and details of what's necessary, from the Torah, teachings from the yeshiva, and you'll normally find that we find it in our siddur at the end of before we starting the Hoidu prayer at the end of the Korbanos section. Okay, so Rabbi Yishmael quoted in our Brisa is now going to teach us his understanding, and he says those three mentions of the nitma, right? The Torah doesn't need to deliberately tell us the case of a priest, and therefore she would be osur. I can derive that. I can have a logical derivation from the from the text using one of the rules of derivation mentioned in that Rabbi Yishmael passage, and utilizing the technique called kal v'chomer. Okay, so if I can refer you to this to the siddur, right? You'll see that kal v'chomer is one of the methodologies that we can understand the Torah. As we concur, it is the first of the methodologies. What's his kal v'chomer? And he says as follows: my logical derivation is as follows: ma grusha shemoteres letruma, but also aseres lekahuna. If a divorced daughter of a priest moving the other way, let's say, so I didn't give the context of this. The rule is, as we just understood, that if you're part of the family, you're allowed to eat. If you're part of the Kahanic family, you're allowed to eat of the Kahanic food, or the portions which are given to the Kohen. If we have a daughter of a priest as part of the family can eat kahuna, it can eat truma, as when she leaves her family house and she becomes part of another family, a non-Kahanic family, she can no longer eat truma. But if she got separated from that family that she was with, right, and therefore she might be, let's say she's a divorced daughter, right, then she goes back to her father's house, and she can now eat truma. So, moving along with our kal v'chomer, if a divorced daughter of a priest who is permitted to partake of truma is nevertheless forbidden to marry into the priesthood, once she is divorced, she can no longer marry another kohen. Then with regard to this Sotah, who is forbidden to partake of truma, is it not logical that there's also prohibited for her to marry into the priesthood, and for her to marry into the priesthood, and therefore she would be also for her to eat any truma in that state.